All right, let's dive into one of the most game-changing events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution. We're talking about how a massive empire, one that stood for 300 years, just crumbled. And it happened in a matter of days, giving rise to the world's first communist state and really changing the course of history forever.
So the big question is, how on earth does that even happen? You have a dynasty that's been in power for 3 centuries, an absolute monarchy that seemed completely unbreakable, and it just vanishes in about a week. It sounds totally impossible, right? But it happened. And the answer, well, it lies in a bunch of fatal weaknesses that were hiding in plain sight the whole time.
We're going to break this all down like a chain reaction, a series of dominoes falling. First, we'll look at Russia's incredibly shaky foundation. Then, we'll get to the war that gave it that final push. From there, we'll see the total power vacuum it created, how Lenin's Bolsheviks jumped in to seize their chance, and finally, the brutal birth of the new Soviet state.
Okay, so let's start with that foundation. The Russian Revolution wasn't this sudden, out-of-nowhere event. The Tsarist regime was, for all intents and purposes, a house of cards. It looked impressive from the outside, but it was built on a foundation that had been rotting from the inside for a very long time.
The whole system was basically crumbling under the weight of 3 huge problems. First, you've got political stagnation. Tsar Nicholas II was, well, an out-of-touch ruler who just refused to modernize. Then, socially, the country was just split right down the middle, between this tiny, super-rich elite and millions upon millions of incredibly poor peasants. And finally, economically, Russia was stuck in the past, a giant agricultural society that was falling way, way behind industrial powerhouses like Britain and Germany. So this was not a stable empire by any stretch. It was a fragile, top-heavy structure just waiting for one big push to send the whole thing crashing down. And that push? It came in the form of a global catastrophe. Which brings us to part 2, the war and the fall. This is where that fragile system meets a completely unstoppable force. One source put it perfectly. They said World War I was the massive honking deal that just blew Russia's internal problems up to completely unmanageable proportions. It took every single crack that was already there, the bad leadership, the social inequality, the weak industry, and just ripped them wide open. The war was the ultimate stress test, and the regime failed, spectacularly. The disaster unfolded on 2 fronts. On the battlefield, Russia was suffering these devastating losses. And Tsar Nicholas made the absolutely terrible decision to take personal command of the army. This meant every single military defeat became his personal failure. Meanwhile, back home, the economy just completely collapsed. You had massive food shortages, prices were skyrocketing, people were literally starving and freezing to death. So the final collapse was just astonishingly fast. In March of 1917, women who were working in factories started protesting bread shortages, and when soldiers were sent to suppress them, they did the unthinkable. They defected and joined the uprising. Within days, the government had lost all control. So on March 15th, with absolutely no authority left, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne. And just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule, it was gone. But with the Tsar gone, things didn't get better. Actually, it just created this massive power vacuum. And this brings us right to our third section. 2 governments, no control. This power vacuum led to, well, total chaos. On one side, you had the official provisional government. Think of it as a group of moderate politicians trying to set up some kind of democracy. But on the other side, you had the Petrograd Soviet, a really powerful council of workers and soldiers that had actual authority on the streets. With 2 governments pulling in totally opposite directions, Russia was basically rudderless. No one was really in charge. And into this chaos steps a man with a very clear plan. This takes us to Section 4, the Bolshevik Revolution, where pretty fringe political parties saw its moment, and they grabbed it. So who were these guys, the Bolsheviks? Well, they were not moderates. They were the most extreme, radical faction of Russian Marxists out there. They believed the only way forward was to completely and violently destroy the old system and build a brand new communist society from the ashes. And they had 2 absolutely brilliant leaders. You had Vladimir Lenin, who was the ideological mastermind. He was the guy who could take complex Marxist theory and turn it into a simple, actionable plan for a takeover. And then you had his right-hand man, Leon Trotsky. He was the organizational genius who could turn a chaotic mob of revolutionaries into a disciplined, effective fighting force. Lenin's political genius is really summed up perfectly in this simple, powerful slogan: peace, Land and bread. I mean, think about it. What did the Russian people want more than anything else? Peace to get them out of that disastrous war, land for the peasants who worked it day in and day out, and bread to stop the starvation. This message just cut through all the political noise and spoke directly to what millions of people were desperate for. So while that provisional government was just floundering, completely lost, the Bolsheviks were organizing, and in November 1917, they made their move. Now, unlike the spontaneous uprising back in March, this was a carefully planned coup. They seized key locations in the capital city, and the super weak provisional government just melted away. The Second Revolution was now complete. But grabbing power is one thing, holding on to it, that's a whole other ballgame. And this brings us to our final section, From War to a New State, which covers the absolutely horrific price of creating the Soviet Union. The Bolshevik takeover immediately plunged Russia into a brutal civil war. On one side, you had the Red Army of the Bolsheviks, and on the other, you had the White Army, which was really just a disorganized mishmash of everyone who opposed them. We're talking monarchists, liberals. They were even backed by foreign powers like the US and Britain. The Reds were actually outnumbered, but they had two huge advantages. First, Trotsky had forged them into a seriously disciplined and effective fighting force. And second, Lenin brilliantly reframed the entire war. It wasn't just a civil war anymore, it was a nationalist defense of Russia against these foreign invaders who were backing the whites. That appeal to patriotism was incredibly powerful. By 1922, the Red Army had won. The fighting was finally over, and the Bolsheviks officially established the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union. A brand new, revolutionary power had just arrived on the world stage. But that victory came at an unimaginable cost. The country was an absolute wreck after nearly a decade of nonstop war. The economy was shattered, the nation was starving, and Lenin came to a brutal realization. Pure communist ideology was not going to be enough to feed his people. So, facing a total collapse, Lenin made a really shocking tactical retreat. He introduced something called the New Economic Policy, or NEP, which temporarily brought back, get this, elements of capitalism. Peasants were suddenly allowed to sell their surplus grain for a profit, and small private businesses could operate again. For Lenin, the goal wasn't ideological purity anymore. It was simple, raw survival. I mean, the NEP was a stunning admission. Here's the leader of the world's first communist revolution basically acknowledging that his state could not survive without a little bit of capitalism. It was a clear choice. Pragmatism had to win out over pure ideology. And that leaves us with one last really fascinating question. The Soviet Union would go on to last for another 70 years, right? Becoming a global superpower. So was this early pragmatic decision to compromise, to take a step back from pure ideology when faced with reality? Was that the secret ingredient that allowed the whole project to survive those incredibly fragile early years and cement its place in history? Definitely something to think about.